In 1971, a birth happened that doctors called a curse. They tried to hide her from the world, but they couldn't hide the truth. He thought they were just low-status, homeless people. He threw water on them, not knowing he was insulting his future boss. Hidden in the woods for 16 years, she didn't just survive. She became the most brilliant mind the world has ever seen. The billionaire came to evict her from her shack. He didn't realize, she had already bought his entire empire. The most elite gala in the city came to a halt when she dropped her veil. See the face that left the billionaire speechless. Do you remember the two-headed baby from 1971? You won't believe what she looks like today. The ending will shock you. Imagine stepping into a time machine and landing in a small, suffocating town in 1971, a place where the color of your skin and the size of your wallet determined whether you were treated like a human being or a ghost. In this town, there was a girl named Analuya. She was the daughter of the town's wealthiest developer, a man who believed that bloodlines were everything. But Analuya did the unthinkable, she fell in love with João Carlos. João was a man of quiet dignity and incredible strength, a laborer who worked the hardest shifts at the steel mill just to afford a small bouquet of wildflowers for the woman he loved. To the town, their union was a scandal. To Anna's father, it was a betrayal that resulted in her being cast out, penniless and stripped of her name. By the time winter arrived in January 1971, the once pampered heiress was living in a drafty, one-room shack on the edge of the woods, her belly heavy with a child that the town whispered was tainted by their forbidden love. The night Clara Luz was born, the sky didn't just rain, it wept. A violent, howling storm tore through the valley, knocking out power lines and turning the roads into rivers of mud. When Analuya's labor began, it wasn't the rhythmic, natural progression most mothers experience. It was a sudden, violent convulsion of pain that made the walls of their tiny shack tremble. João Carlos, terrified but resolute, carried his wife through the knee-deep mud for 2 miles to reach the only hospital in the county. He arrived at the emergency doors soaked to the bone, his muscles screaming with exhaustion, begging for help. But the head nurse, a woman named Martha whose heart was as cold as the linoleum floors, took one look at João's tattered clothes and his dark skin and told him to wait in the alley because the respectable patients shouldn't be disturbed by his presence. Inside the hospital, the air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and the unspoken arrogance of the elite. Dr. Aris, a man who measured his worth by his medical degrees and his connections to the governor, was the physician on call. He treated Analuya not with the care a mother deserves, but with the cold detachment of a scientist examining a specimen. "You made your bed when you ran off with that man," he whispered into her ear as she writhed in pain. "Don't expect a miracle tonight." He didn't check the fetal heartbeat with care, he didn't offer a kind word. He was ready to deliver the child and send them back into the storm, hoping they would simply disappear from his perfect town. But as the delivery reached its peak, the atmosphere in the room shifted from cold indifference to paralyzed terror. The flickering fluorescent lights overhead buzzed and hummed as if the building itself was nervous. When the baby finally began to emerge, the silence that followed was more deafening than the thunder outside. Dr. Aris reached out to receive the child, but his hands froze mid-air. He didn't pull the baby toward him. Instead, he recoiled, his stool scraping harshly against the floor as he backed away. The nurse, Martha, gasped so loudly it sounded like a scream, dropping a tray of surgical instruments that clattered like thunder on the tiles. There, in the dim, flickering light, lay a child with one body, but 2 distinct, perfectly formed heads. Each head possessed a crown of fine, golden hair and eyes that were a piercing, electric cobalt blue, eyes that didn't look like those of a newborn, but like eyes that had already seen the secrets of the universe. "It's a monster," Martha whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and disgust. "It's a sign of the Father's curse. We can't let this thing stay here." The doctor, regaining his composure but replaced by a sinister opportunism, looked at the baby and then at the door where João Carlos was pacing. He didn't see a human life, he saw a career-ending scandal or a once-in-a-lifetime curiosity he could use for fame. He ordered the nurses to take the baby away before Ana Luia could even see her. "Tell the mother the child didn't make it," Eris commanded, his voice devoid of any soul. "We will handle the disposal quietly. No one needs to know a freak like this was ever born in my hospital." But they underestimated the bond of a mother. Despite her exhaustion, despite the blood loss and the trauma, Ana Luia sat up, her eyes burning with a fire that stopped the nurses in their tracks. "Give me my daughter," she rasped. When they tried to block her view, she found a strength that defied medical logic, lunging forward to grab the bundle from the table. When she saw the two heads, she didn't scream. She didn't faint. She pulled the baby to her chest and shielded her with her own body. "Her name is Clara Luz," Anna whispered, tears of joy and defiance streaming down her face. "And she is more perfect than any of you will ever be." The news of the two-headed miracle, or the two-headed demon, spread through the hospital like a wildfire in a dry forest. Within 30 minutes, despite the storm, a small crowd of the town's most prominent citizens, the mayor, the local priest, and the wealthy landowners, had gathered in the lobby. They weren't there to offer charity. They were there to demand that the child be removed. They saw Clara Luz as a physical manifestation of the sin of João and Anna's love. They feared that her presence would bring bad luck to their crops or their businesses. The social hierarchy of 1971 was closing its jaws around the infant, ready to crush her before she even took her first full day of breath. Outside, in the pouring rain, João Carlos heard the whispers. He saw the angry faces through the glass doors. He realized that the hospital wasn't a place of healing for his family, it was a cage. He knew that if he didn't act now, Dr. Eris and the town council would take his daughter away to a laboratory or worse. As the doctor approached Ana Luia with a sedative, intending to put her to sleep so he could seize the baby, the doors to the delivery room burst open. João Carlos stood there, a giant of a man covered in mud and rainwater, his eyes fixed on his wife and child. "We are leaving," he declared. The doctor laughed, calling for security, mocking João's low status and his lack of power. "You have nothing," Eris sneered. "No money, no home, and now, a child that isn't even human. You will give her to us, or you will spend the rest of your life in a cell." What the doctor didn't know was that João Carlos had spent every day of his life being underestimated, and he had learned exactly how to turn that to his advantage. He didn't use violence, he used the one thing the doctor feared most, publicity. João had brought with him a young, hungry journalist from the neighboring county's newspaper who had been following the story of the cast-out heiress. As the journalist's camera flash popped, illuminating the doctor's panicked face and the beautiful, haunting faces of Clara Luz, the power dynamic shifted in an instant. The low-status father had just documented the doctor's attempt to steal a child. This was the beginning of a war that would last for decades. As João, Ana, and the baby disappeared into the night, escaping the hospital before the police could arrive, they left behind a town filled with fear and a doctor filled with rage. They were now fugitives of a society that couldn't handle their existence. But as they huddled together in the back of a rusted truck, driving toward the unknown, the two heads of Clara Luz did something that no newborn should be able to do. They both opened their cobalt eyes, looked at their father, and, in perfect, eerie unison, they let out a soft, melodic hum that sounded like a song from another world. The journey into the shadows had begun, but the light they carried within them was already starting to burn. The escape from the hospital was not just a flight from a building, it was a desperate plunge into a world that had effectively erased their existence. As the rusted truck rattled down the muddy backroads of the county, the headlights flickering like dying stars, João Carlos looked at his wife and daughter in the rearview mirror. Ana Luia sat huddled in a pile of burlap sacks, her golden hair matted with sweat and rain, but her arms were locked around the bundle that contained the two souls the world had already branded as a mistake. The transition from her father's mansion to this damp, shivering reality was a chasm most would have fallen into, but Ana Luia found a strange, feral peace in the darkness. She knew that as long as they were in the shadows, they were safe from the scalpels and the cameras of the civilized world. They drove until the gas gauge sat on empty, eventually rolling to a stop in the heart of an abandoned industrial district 3 towns over, a graveyard of rusted iron and shattered glass where the low-status people of society went to disappear. The first year of Clara Luz's life was a masterclass in human endurance. They found shelter in the basement of a defunct textile mill, a cavernous space that smelled of oil and old secrets. João Carlos became a shadow in the city, taking on the jobs that no one else would touch, cleaning sewers, hauling coal in the dead of night, and scavenging scrap metal until his hands were permanently stained with the grime of the earth. He was a man of immense physical power, but in the eyes of the shopkeepers and the foremen, he was just another nameless laborer, nobody who didn't deserve a second glance. They saw his tattered coat and his tired eyes, and they treated him with a casual cruelty that would have broken a lesser man. They would toss his meager wages onto the ground rather than hand them to him, or mock his silence, never realizing that this nobody was the sole protector of a miracle that would one day redefine their understanding of the human mind. Inside the cold walls of the mill, the miracle was unfolding in ways that defied every medical textbook Dr. Aris had ever read. Clara Luz was not growing like a normal child, she was developing with a terrifying, beautiful synchronicity. By the age of 2, while other children were struggling with simple words, the two heads of Clara Luz were already engaging in complex, silent dialogues through expressions and hums. The left head, Clara, was the observer. Her blue eyes were always scanning, calculating the distance between objects and the mechanics of the machines around them. The right head, Luz, was the empath. She was the one who would mirror her mother's emotions, offering a soft smile when Ana Luia's strength faltered. They didn't just share a body, they shared a neurological network that seemed to operate on a higher frequency. When they finally began to speak, they didn't babble. They spoke in full, poetic sentences, often alternating words between the two mouths so seamlessly that it sounded like a single, melodic voice coming from two directions at once. However, the world outside was not finished with them. Dr. Aris, driven by a mixture of professional obsession and a deep-seated fear that the proof of his malpractice was still breathing, had used his influence to start a quiet, localized hunt. He didn't tell the police. He told the collectors, men who worked in the fringes of the medical and circus industries. He put a bounty on a biological rarity, describing the child as a dangerous anomaly that needed to be contained for public safety. The rumors began to filter down into the slums. People started talking about the two-headed ghost that lived in the old mill. One evening, a group of local thugs, hoping to collect the bounty, cornered João Carlos as he was returning with a small bag of flour. They mocked his deformed family, calling his daughter a freak and threatening to burn the nest if he didn't hand her over. João stood like a mountain, his silence becoming a deafening roar of defiance. He took the beating they gave him without uttering a sound, shielding the flour with his body, because he knew that his survival was the only thing keeping the wolves away from his daughter's door. The suspense of their daily life was a tightrope walk. One afternoon, when Clara Luz was nearly 5, Ana Luia took the risk of bringing her to a small, remote park on the outskirts of the district, hoping the child could feel the sun on her skin. She kept the girls' heads hidden under a wide-brimmed hat and a thick scarf, but the child's curiosity was too great. A wealthy woman, dressed in fine silk and pearls, happened to be walking her dog nearby. When the wind caught the hat and revealed, for a split second, the two faces of the child, the woman didn't scream, she sneered. "What kind of animal allows such a thing to walk in public?" the woman hissed, pulling her dog away as if the very air around Clara Luz was poisonous. "You people are a blight. You should be locked away where the sun can't see your shame." She pulled out a small, expensive camera and snapped a photo, promising to call the authorities. That moment of discrimination, of being treated like a blight, was the catalyst for the next phase of their lives. Ana Luia didn't beg for mercy. She stood up, took Clara Luz by the hand, and looked the wealthy woman in the eye with a dignity that made the woman's pearls look like cheap glass. "You see shame because your heart is too small to see anything else," Ana Luia said, her voice steady and chillingly calm. "But remember this face, because one day, you will be the one begging for a seat at her table." They vanished back into the industrial maze before the police arrived, but that photograph would eventually find its way into the hands of Dr. Eris, reigniting the fire of the chase. As they moved to an even more remote location, a hidden valley in the woods where an old, abandoned cabin stood, the instant karma seeds were being watered by the family's resilience. While the world saw a homeless man, a disgraced heiress, and a freak, the cabin was becoming a university of the soul. Clara and Luz began to teach themselves from the books Joao would find in the trash of the wealthy neighborhoods. They would analyze philosophy, physics, and law by the light of a single candle. The two minds worked in a binary fashion, one checking the other's logic, one expanding on the other's creativity. They were becoming a superintelligence, hidden in the skin of a social outcast. They knew the world hated them, but they also knew something the world didn't. The low-status family they were hunting was actually the most advanced human evolution on the planet. The part ends with a chilling moment of suspense. Late one night, as the family slept in the cabin, the sound of a heavy engine echoed through the trees. Joao Carlos sat up, his hand reaching for the sharpened iron rod he kept by the door. Through the cracks in the wooden walls, he saw the flash of high-powered torches. Dr. Eris hadn't found them yet, but his collectors were close. They were circling the woods like vultures. Clara Luz woke up, both of her heads turning toward the door in perfect synchronization. She didn't look afraid, she looked focused. "They are looking for a monster, Papa," Luz whispered. "But they aren't ready for the truth," Clara finished. The family began to pack their few belongings, preparing to disappear deeper into the wilderness, into the places where the civilized world was too afraid to follow. The hunt was on, but the hunters had no idea that their prey was already 5 moves ahead of them. The year was 1987, and the world outside the valley was screaming with the neon lights of progress, greed, and a booming stock market. But inside the emerald canopy of the silent valley, time seemed to have folded in on itself. Clara Luz was now 16 years old, a young woman whose physical existence remained a secret kept by the whispering pines and the iron-willed protection of her father, Joao Carlos. By now, the two heads, Clara and Luz, had matured into a terrifyingly beautiful duality. They no longer just shared a body, they functioned like a biological supercomputer. While other teenagers were worried about prom and pop music, Clara was mentally calculating the trajectory of the stars she saw through the cabin's skylight, and Luz was composing intricate, multi-layered symphonies in her head that required 2 voices to truly perform. Their hair had grown long and silken, a waterfall of gold that draped over their shared shoulders, and their cobalt eyes had darkened into the color of a midnight ocean, piercing, knowing, and deeply unsettling to anyone who didn't understand the love that forged them. The suspense of their lives had shifted from the fear of being caught to the pressure of an impending eruption. Ana Luia's health was failing rapidly. The years of living in damp cabins and the constant stress of being a fugitive had turned her porcelain skin into translucent parchment. One afternoon, as the mist clung to the valley floor like a wet shroud, Ana Luia sat by the fireplace, watching her daughter read 3 books simultaneously, one held by the left hand for Clara, one by the right for Luz, and a third balanced on their knees that they scanned together in a haunting, synchronized rhythm. "The world is coming, my loves," Anna whispered, her voice a dry rattle. "I can feel the machines in the earth. They aren't looking for you yet, but they are looking for what lies beneath us. When they come, they will try to treat you like a tragedy. You must show them you are a triumph." That night, the first sign of the machines appeared. A low, rhythmic thumping of a helicopter circling the mountain, its searchlight cutting through the fog like the eye of a vengeful god. Joao Carlos, now a man whose hair was streaked with the silver of 1,000 battles, spent his days deeper in the northern caves of the valley. He wasn't just hiding, he was prospecting. He had discovered something while digging a well years ago, a vein of mineral so strange, so luminously blue, that it seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. In the flicking light of a lantern, Clara and Luz had analyzed the samples their father brought back. Using an old chemistry set and textbooks Joao had borrowed from a university dumpster years prior, the girls realized the truth. It wasn't just copper or cobalt, it was a rare earth deposit of a mineral the world hadn't yet named, a natural superconductor that could revolutionize the burgeoning tech industry of the late 80s. To the world, they were homeless squatters on worthless land. In reality, the low-status family was sitting on a throne of wealth that could buy the very city that had exiled them. The tranquility of the valley was shattered on a Tuesday morning when a fleet of black SUVs tore through the underbrush, followed by a bulldozer that groaned like a hungry beast. Out of the lead vehicle stepped Marcus Aris, the son of the doctor who had tried to dispose of Clara Luz in 1971. Marcus was the embodiment of 1980s arrogance, a man in a $1,000 suit, wearing gold-rimmed aviators, clutching a legal brief like a weapon. He was the CEO of Aris Development, a company built on the stolen medical patents and donations his father had acquired through a career of exploitation. Marcus didn't see a home when he looked at the cabin, he saw an obstacle to a multi-billion-dollar resort. He didn't see a man when he looked at João Carlos, who stood at the edge of the porch, he saw a pest to be exterminated. "Listen, old man," Marcus shouted, not even bothering to step out of the mud. This land was acquired by the state for environmental reassessment. You've got 1 hour to pack your trash and get out, or I'll have the bulldozer flatten this shack with you inside it. The emotional depth of the moment was suffocating. João Carlos didn't move. He didn't beg. He simply looked at Marcus with a pity that infuriated the younger man. "You have the papers, but you don't have the truth," João said calmly. Marcus laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "Truth? The truth is I have a checkbook and a legal team that can erase you from existence. Look at you, you're a ghost. You're a nobody. You've spent 16 years hiding in the dirt. Why? To protect that thing people say you've got hidden in there. My father told me about the freak he delivered. He said it was the greatest regret of his career that he let you walk out with it." Inside the cabin, Clara and Luz heard every word. The insult didn't make them cry, it made them ignite. For the first time in 16 years, the two-headed baby didn't hide. The door creaked open, and Clara Luz stepped out into the light. The silence that followed was visceral. The construction workers stopped their engines. The wind seemed to die down. Marcus Aris froze, his mouth hanging open as his aviators slipped down his nose. He expected a monster, a hunched creature of nightmares. Instead, he saw a tall, elegant young woman with two faces of ethereal beauty, looking at him with a gaze so intense it felt like his soul was being dissected. "The thing your father delivered," Clara began, her voice steady and logical, "is currently the legal owner of the mineral rights to this entire mountain range." Luz finished the sentence, her voice rising in a melodic, mocking trill, "and we've already filed a preemptive injunction in the federal court using a name you wouldn't recognize, the Gemini Trust." Marcus recoiled as if he'd been slapped. "That's impossible. The Gemini Trust is a ghost entity. They've been buying up our debt for months." Clara Luz stepped off the porch, walking toward him with a grace that was uncanny. "We didn't just buy your debt, Marcus," Clara said, her blue eyes flashing. "We bought your father's medical practice. We bought the hospital where you were born. And we bought the very car you're leaning on." Luz tilted her head, a small, dangerous smile playing on her lips. "You see, while you were busy being high status, we were busy becoming your landlord. You called us a blight. We are the cure for the corruption your family represents." The instant karma was a physical weight in the air. Marcus tried to bark an order to the bulldozer driver, but his cell phone, one of those brick-sized early models, began to ring. It was his father, Dr. Aris, screaming on the other end that their bank accounts had been frozen and a federal investigation into their land grab schemes had been launched by a mysterious whistleblower. Marcus looked at Clara Luz, seeing not a freak, but a predator who had spent 16 years sharpening her teeth in the dark. He realized that every act of cruelty his father had inflicted in 1971 had been recorded, every penny of their wealth was being stripped away by the very child they had deemed worthless. The part ends with Marcus and his team retreating in a cloud of dust, leaving the valley in a temporary, heavy silence. But the victory was bittersweet. As João Carlos turned to celebrate with his daughter, they heard a faint, final sigh from inside the cabin. They rushed in to find Ana Luia, a peaceful smile on her face, her hand still resting on the notebook where she had recorded every word her daughters had ever spoken. She had lived long enough to see the world tremble at her daughter's feet. Clara and Luz knelt by their mother's side, their 4 eyes overflowing with tears, their 2 voices merging into a single, haunting lament that echoed through the trees. They were no longer just survivors, they were the owners of their destiny. But as the sun set over the valley, the suspense returned. They knew Marcus wouldn't go quietly, and the collectors his father had hired years ago were now more desperate than ever. The war wasn't over, it was just moving from the woods to the marble halls of power. The mourning period for Ana Luia was not a time of quiet withdrawal, but a cold, calculated transformation. In the wake of her mother's death, the 2 minds of Clara Luz forged a singular purpose: the time for hiding in the shadows of the valley was over. The year was now 1991, and the world was beginning to pulse with the digital dawn, a landscape perfectly suited for a mind that could process information at twice the speed of a normal human. João Carlos, though aged and weathered like an old oak, stood by his daughter as they packed the tattered remains of their forest life. They didn't leave as refugees, they left as a silent storm front. Using the initial liquid assets from the Gemini Trust, funded by the secret mineral deposits, they transitioned to a high-security penthouse in the city, a fortress of glass and steel that overlooked the very streets where they had once been doused with mop water. Inside this sanctuary, Clara Luz underwent a metamorphosis. She wasn't just a woman with 2 heads, she was becoming a myth. She spent months studying the social hierarchies of the elite, mastering languages, corporate law, and the intricate dance of high society etiquette. She learned to use fashion as both a shield and a statement, designing custom garments that allowed her to navigate the world with a haunting, statuesque grace that left people breathless before they could even formulate a word of prejudice. The suspense in the city was palpable. While the public knew nothing of Clara Luz's physical presence, the name, the Gemini Architect, was becoming a whispered legend in the boardrooms of the world's most powerful corporations. A series of anonymous, brilliant maneuvers had begun to systematically dismantle the Aris family's empire. Dr. Aris, now an elder statesman of the medical community, was preparing for the Gala of the Century, a black tie event designed to celebrate his lifetime of ethical contributions to science. He was oblivious to the fact that the thing he had tried to erase in 1971 was currently the primary shareholder of the very foundation hosting his party. He spent his days in his marble office, complaining to his son Marcus about the ghost that was eating their profits, never realizing that the ghost was living just 3 blocks away, watching him through the lens of the city's growing surveillance network. Marcus, still reeling from the humiliation in the valley, was obsessed with finding the freak, convinced that if he could capture her, he could regain his father's respect and the family's lost prestige. He hired mercenaries and private investigators, turning the city into a hunting ground, unaware that he was the one being led into a trap. The night of the gala arrived, a sweltering evening where the air felt thick with the scent of expensive perfume and impending judgment. The venue was the Grand Metropolitan Museum, a palace of art and history that stood as a monument to high-status achievement. Dr. Aris stood at the top of the grand staircase, his chest adorned with medals, greeting the elite with a smile that never reached his cold, calculating eyes. He felt invincible. Meanwhile, at the service entrance, a nondescript delivery van arrived. Out stepped João Carlos, dressed in the humble uniform of a catering technician. To the security guards and the snobbish event planners, he was just another low-status laborer, an invisible cog in the machine. They barked orders at him, mocking his slow movements and his aged face, telling him to stay out of the way of the real people. João took the insults with a terrifyingly calm smile. He was the Trojan horse, and inside the equipment crates he was wheeling into the ballroom was the technology that would broadcast the night's events to every major news outlet in the country. As the orchestra began to play, a figure entered the ballroom that caused the music to falter for a fraction of a second. She was draped in a gown of shimmering, midnight blue silk that flowed like liquid around a frame that seemed impossibly elegant. A delicate, translucent veil of silver lace covered her upper features, trailing behind her like the wings of a moth. She moved with a synchronized fluidity that was hypnotic. The guests whispered, wondering which European royal or tech renegade this could be. She didn't head for the bar or the dance floor, she walked straight toward the VIP table where Dr. Eris and Marcus sat like kings. Marcus felt a shiver of recognition, a memory of cobalt blue eyes and a voice that sounded like a duet, but he dismissed it. Surely, the monster from the woods wouldn't dare step into the light of the Grand Metropolitan. He stood up, flashing a predatory grin, hoping to charm this mysterious, wealthy newcomer. "I don't believe we've been introduced," Marcus said, his voice dripping with unearned confidence. "I am Marcus Eris, the future of this city." Clara Luz stopped, her presence commanding a vacuum of silence in the surrounding area. Clara, the logical mind, observed the micro-expressions of fear beginning to bloom on Dr. Eris's face. Luz, the emotional heart, felt the surge of justice rising like a tide. "The future is a fickle thing, Marcus," the woman replied. The two voices, perfectly harmonized and hauntingly beautiful, echoed off the marble walls. The guests nearby froze, their glasses halfway to their lips. The sound was impossible, a natural harmony that no single human could produce. Dr. Eris stood up, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. "That voice." He stammered, his mind racing back 20 years to a cold hospital room and a baby he had branded a curse. "It can't be. Guards. This woman is an intruder. Remove her." The tension snapped like a dry branch. Security moved in, but they were stopped by the sheer authority of her stance. "Wait," Clara Luz commanded, and the word carried the weight of a queen's decree. She turned to the crowd, the silver veil catching the light of the chandeliers. "You all are here to celebrate the ethics of a man who built his career on the theft of lives he deemed low status. You celebrate a man who tried to murder a child because she didn't fit his definition of a human being." The guests murmured in confusion, but the suspense was only beginning. On the massive projector screens behind the stage, where Dr. Eris's achievements were supposed to be displayed, a grainy, black and white image suddenly appeared. It was the photograph taken in the hospital in 1971, the one the journalist had snapped. It showed a younger, panicked Dr. Eris trying to snatch a two-headed infant from a mother's arms. The ballroom gasped as one. The instant karma was beginning to circulate through the room like a poison. Marcus, desperate to regain control, lunged forward to grab the woman's veil. "You're a freak. A mistake of nature. You think you can come here and judge us?" He reached out, his hand trembling with rage, and ripped the silver lace away. The reveal was more dramatic than any of them could have imagined. Under the harsh gala lights, Clara Luz stood revealed in all her breathtaking, terrifying glory. Her two faces were masterpieces of symmetry and intelligence, her cobalt eyes burning with a fire that seemed to illuminate the entire hall. She didn't look like a mistake, she looked like a masterpiece. The elite of the city, the people who had spent their lives looking down on the different, found themselves unable to look away. They weren't looking at a monster, they were looking at the person who had quietly bought their debts, their homes, and their futures. The part ends with Clara Luz leaning in close to the trembling Dr. Eris, her two mouths whispering in unison, "Do you remember me now, Doctor? Or should I remind you of what happened to the homeless family you threw into the rain?" The silence in the Grand Metropolitan Museum was no longer a sign of respect, it was the heavy, suffocating stillness of a courtroom before a death sentence is read. As Clara Luz stood under the crystal chandeliers, her two faces illuminated by the flashbulbs of 100 cameras, the social hierarchy of the city didn't just bend, it shattered. Dr. Eris, the man who had built a career on the myth of his own moral superiority, was now shrinking, his skin turning a translucent, sickly gray as he clutched the edge of the podium for support. The instant karma was not just a feeling, it was a physical force in the room. The very guests who had spent the evening laughing at Marcus's jokes about low-status workers were now looking at their own hands, realizing that the woman they had labeled a freak was the person who held their mortgages, their stock portfolios, and their secrets. Clara Luz didn't need to raise her voice to be heard. When she spoke, the dual resonance of her vocal cords created a frequency that seemed to vibrate in the chests of everyone present, a sound that was both hauntingly alien and undeniably authoritative. The suspense deepened as the invisible staff, the waiters, the janitors, and the security guards, began to move in a synchronized pattern that had clearly been rehearsed for years. They weren't retreating, they were surrounding the VIP platform. These were not random employees, they were the Silent Legion, a group of individuals whom the heiress family and the town's elite had discarded over the decades, people who had been fired for being too old, too poor, or too different. Under the direction of João Carlos, they had been trained and employed by the Gemini Trust. The low-status army had finally occupied the fortress of the elite. Marcus Aris, his face contorted in a mask of panicked rage, tried to lung toward the stage, screaming for his private security. But his men didn't move. They had already been paid double by the trust to stand down. Marcus was alone in a room full of people he had once looked down upon, and for the first time in his life, he felt the cold, sharp edge of being truly powerless. "You think this changes anything?" Marcus hissed, his voice cracking. "You're still a mistake. You're still something that shouldn't exist." Clara and Luz looked at him simultaneously, their cobalt eyes filled not with hatred, but with a profound, icy pity. "Existence is not defined by your permission, Marcus," Clara said, her voice the sharp edge of logic. "And value is not defined by your bank account," Luz added, her voice the velvet of a final judgment. Behind them, the massive screens began to scroll through a live data feed. It wasn't just the hospital records from 1971, it was a real-time ledger of the heiress family's collapse. Every shell company, every offshore account, and every falsified medical patent was being exposed to the federal authorities and the press in a digital deluge. The collectors, the mercenaries Dr. Aris had hired to hunt Clara Luz for years, were shown on screen being intercepted by state police at the edge of the city. The hunters had become the hunted, and the freak they had chased was now the architect of their incarceration. The room watched in a trance-like state as the high-status empire of the Aris family was erased in less than 10 minutes. But the most emotional beat of the night was yet to come. As Dr. Aris was led away in handcuffs, his head bowed in shame, a man stood up from the darkest corner of the ballroom. He was a man of immense age, his hair a shock of white, his suit costing more than most people earned in a decade. This was Arthur Beaumont, the patriarch of the town and the man who had cast Ana Luia out into the rain 20 years ago for the crime of loving João Carlos. He was Clara Luz's grandfather. The room held its breath as the bold guard approached the miracle. Arthur Beaumont walked slowly, his cane clicking against the marble floor like the ticking of a clock. He stopped 3 feet from Clara Luz, his eyes searching her 2 faces for a glimpse of the daughter he had abandoned. The silence was so profound you could hear the distant sirens of the police cars arriving outside. "You have her eyes," Arthur whispered, his voice trembling with a regret that had arrived 20 years too late. "Both of you. You have Ana Luia's eyes." He reached out a withered hand, his fingers shaking, attempting to touch the face of the grandchild he had deemed a stain on his legacy. The tension was unbearable. Would Clara Luz embrace the man who had caused her family so much suffering? Would she seek revenge? Instead, she did something that showed the true height of her status. She didn't flinch, and she didn't strike back. She simply stepped back, maintaining a distance that was more painful than any blow. "Ana Luia died in a cabin with no heat because of your status," Clara said. "She spent her life hiding from the world because you were ashamed of the love that created us," Luz continued. "We don't want your money, Arthur. We don't want your name. We have already bought your estate. Tomorrow, it becomes a sanctuary for families like the one you tried to destroy." The instant karma for Arthur Beaumont wasn't poverty, it was the realization that he was a stranger to the most brilliant minds the world had ever seen, minds that shared his own blood. He stood there, a billionaire with nothing, as his granddaughter turned her back on him. The gala was no longer a party, it was a funeral for an old way of thinking. As the police cleared the room and the elite scurried to their limousines to call their lawyers, Clara Luz walked to the center of the stage and looked at her father, João Carlos. He stood there, the homeless man of 1971, now the most respected figure in the room. He didn't need a tuxedo to look like a king. They shared a look of pure, unadulterated triumph, a victory for every person who had ever been told they weren't enough. The part ends with a shocking twist. As the ballroom emptied, a hidden door behind the stage creaked open. A group of men in dark suits, bearing the insignia of a global clandestine organization, stepped into the light. These weren't Dr. Eris's thugs, these were the Oversight, a shadowy group that had been monitoring Clara Luz's intellectual output for years. They didn't care about justice or karma, they cared about the superintelligence she possessed. While Clara Luz had won the battle against her family's past, she had inadvertently signaled her location to a much more dangerous enemy. One of the men stepped forward, holding a device that began to hum with a strange, dampening frequency. "Clara Luz," he said, his voice cold and robotic. "The world isn't ready for what you can do. But we are." The screen fades to black as the sirens outside are drowned out by the sound of a heavy, metallic door locking. The final part of the journey was no longer about social justice, it was about survival. The hum of the high-security facility was a sterile, vibrating note that felt like it was trying to pry apart the very thoughts of Clara and Luz. For 48 hours, they had been held in a room made of glass and reinforced steel, a containment suite designed by the Oversight, a shadow organization that saw the world not as a collection of people, but as a series of resources to be managed. Director Vane, a man whose emotions had been surgically replaced by cold efficiency, sat behind a monitor, watching the dual brain activity of Clara Luz. To him, she was the ultimate prize, a biological supercomputer. He didn't care about the justice she had served or the family she had saved, he wanted to map her neural pathways to create the next generation of artificial intelligence. Once again, Clara Luz found herself in the position she had occupied since 1971, a person being looked at as an anomaly to be dissected rather than a woman to be respected. But Vane made the same mistake everyone else had made for 50 years, he assumed that because he had her in a cage, he had her in his control. The suspense within the facility reached a breaking point on the third night. While Vane and his team of scientists attempted to use a neural sync frequency to force Clara Luz's two minds into a submissive state, they didn't realize that they were providing her with the very tool she needed to escape. The frequency was a digital bridge, and for a mind like Clara Luz's, a bridge worked both ways. As Clara, the strategist, analyzed the encryption of the facility's mainframe, Luz, the empath, began to sing back through the neural link. It wasn't a song of words, but a harmonic resonance that mirrored the facility's own security protocols. In the control room, the monitors began to flicker. Vane's high-status technology, worth billions of dollars, was being rewritten by a woman the world had once doused with mop water in a diner. The low-status victim was now a digital god, and the walls of the most secret facility on Earth were starting to crumble from the inside out. The escape was not a desperate run, but a calculated walk of power. As the heavy blast doors slid open of their own accord, Clara Luz stepped out into the corridor, her two faces calm, her blue eyes reflecting the glowing red of the emergency lights. João Carlos was there, having been liberated from his own holding cell by the very systems Clara had hacked. Together, they walked through the heart of the Oversight's headquarters. Soldiers with high-tech weaponry raised their rifles, but they couldn't pull the triggers, the biometric locks on their guns had been remotely disabled. Clara Luz looked at Director Vane through the final security window. She didn't use a weapon, she used a truth. On every screen in the facility, and every screen in the city outside, the secret files of the Oversight began to scroll. Their illegal experiments, their global manipulations, and their plans to weaponize human intelligence were broadcast to the world in a flood of data that could never be erased. The instant karma for the world's most powerful men was the sudden, total loss of their anonymity. This leads us to the moment everyone has been waiting for, the "see what she looks like today" reveal. It is no longer 1971, nor 1991. We are in the present day. The camera pans across a magnificent, futuristic campus, the Honolulu Global Institute. This is the house that respect built. A woman of incredible presence walks through the gardens, greeted by scientists, artists, and children from every walk of life. She is now in her mid-50s, and time has only added to her majesty. Her hair, once golden, is now a stunning, regal silver that frames her two faces like a halo. She wears no veil, she hides from no one. Her skin is etched with the lines of a life lived with more intensity than any two people combined. She is the most respected person on the planet, an advisor to world leaders and a beacon for the marginalized. When people see her today, they don't see a two-headed baby. They see the woman who proved that the low-status person you ignore today might be the one who saves the world tomorrow. The final emotional beat occurs in a quiet corner of the institute, where a statue of a young João Carlos in Honolulu stands, holding a small, swaddled bundle. Clara Luz stands before it with her father, who is now a very old man, his eyes still bright with pride. He looks at his daughter, at both of her faces, and he sees the fulfillment of the promise made in a cold hospital room 50 years ago. They remember, Papa, Clara says, her voice a rich, seasoned melody. They remember the baby from 1971, Luz adds. But now, they don't look at us with fear. They look at us with hope. João Carlos takes her hand, his rough, weathered fingers interlaced with her own. He knows that his job is done. He took a child the world wanted to throw away and gave her the one thing no amount of money could buy, the belief that she was worthy of love and respect. The story of Clara Luz ends not with a grand speech, but with a simple act of kindness that echoes through the generations. As she walks through the institute, she sees a young boy who was born with a different kind of physical challenge, being mocked by a group of visiting students. Clara Luz stops. The bullies freeze, their faces turning pale as they realize who is standing before them. She doesn't scold them, she simply kneels down so she is at eye level with the young boy. Never let them tell you who you are, her two voices whisper in a harmony that feels like a warm embrace. The world will try to make you feel small so they can feel big. But you carry a universe inside you. The bullies, moved by a sudden, overwhelming sense of shame and realization, step forward to apologize. In that moment, the cycle of instant karma and social justice is complete. Respect has been earned, not through power, but through the undeniable light of a soul that refused to be dimmed.